I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Welcome to the Poetry of Predicament Podcast. In this episode, which is March of 2018, we're going to be speaking with Earth and Paleo Climate Scientist Andrew Glikson. He's with the Australian National University. And yes, we will talk about his recent book, The Pluto Scene, and we'll talk about his many articles, but more we'll be talking about his poetry and his way of coping with the dire information that he's privy to, given his work and his science. It should be a great episode of Poetry of Predicament. Join us. Yeah, you know by now I'm Dean Walker, and I am in a kind of an unusual line of work these days. I've been in the training business for a long time, training executives to work more effectively together, and working with training with personal development work with couples for more intimacy, and working with at-risk youth in the UK and the USA, training adults to work with troubled kids. And now where I've ended up is creating a body of work that is intended to give people a much more powerful inner toolkit to be able to face these extraordinary times that we're in. And
yeah, all right. Yeah, that's very impressive.
Yeah. So that's really why I wanted to speak with you. I wanted to let you know that you're one of a very small handful of scientists in your field that really have what I would call courage to put out the kind of information that you do, the kind of data that you do, and it also include a very human and very, somewhat urgent call to action. And, unfortunately, there are many...
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's I think an extraordinary time on planet Earth. I think it's a time in human history that is like no other that's been before it, and it's definitely not a time to be overly diplomatic or polite. So when someone like you, who is an expert in your field, is willing to step up and really tell it like it is, I deeply appreciate it.
Yes, it's a thankless job, so to people know how serious the situation is. I cannot say I enjoyed it all. In fact, it gives me a lot of heartbreak.
Yeah, you and me both. You and me both. So I would like to just start out, just to give a brief introduction so we can start out the official recording of the interview here. I'm, in this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, really pleased to have Professor Andrew Glikson from Australian National University. He's an earth and paleo climate scientist and author of several books. Most recent one I'll mention in just a moment. Innumerable articles. It won't take you long if you go and look up the recent articles put out by Professor Glikson. I just lost count of the number of different internet sources for your articles. So that's congratulations on being well received out there. And I did want to mention the
Yes, thank you.
Uh-huh. The Plutocene is your most recent book, if I'm understanding it right, and the subtitle Blueprint for a Post-Anthropocene Greenhouse Earth. And quite evidently, that is where we are. But what we were just talking about a few moments ago is how few, certainly how few climate scientists are really stepping up and putting such bold terms on our condition as you are, even in the title of your book. So, Professor Andrew Glikson, welcome to this podcast and this interview. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for your.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I listened to another interview that you did just a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised to hear you had quite a bit to say about a number of different challenges or possibly even predicaments that we're facing on this planet. And one of them was about the nuclear situation, the nuclear dangers. Would you mind starting there and just saying a little bit about what your concerns are with regard to that?
Yes, of course. The nuclear started in 1945.
Yes.
It's easier than the climate predicament. The climate situation has been progressing now essentially since 1975 in serious. But it will still be progressing for a while. No one can say exactly. It can take decades through the rest of the century. But as you know, and if we all know, the nuclear event can happen at any moment now, given the unpredictability, and as well as by accident. A false flag, an accident anywhere around the world, in the China Sea, in the Ukraine, in Syria, an accident can trigger the unthinkable.
Yeah. So I take it that you have a broad view on this planet, far exceeding what you do in your studies, in your actual research. Are there other aspects of our world that, like the nuclear issue, that really have your attention, that really concern you right now?
Well, they definitely are. My field is in air science. With the nuclear during the 1980s, I was a member of a group called Scientists Against Nuclear Arms. And this went on quite a few years. But over the last maybe 16 years or so, I was mostly preoccupied with a climate issue. I look at it from the Paleo Climate point of view, being essentially a geologist by training. I look at the deep time perspective,
right.
And I have studied the great mass extinctions of species. What's happening now is just as serious, and in some ways even more extreme than some of those mass extinction of species.
Yes, yes, I hear you, and I appreciate you have an extraordinary kind of singular focus in that way, and can put it into the kind of context that we've only seen perhaps from, of course, Elizabeth Kolbert in her book of a few years ago, The Sixth Extinction. I'm curious, have you seen this notion of mass extinction? Have you seen changes in that just in the past few years?
Oh, definitely. It's happening all the time. If you look at the publications of Wilderness Society and similar, the Sierra Club and so on, species are now getting extinct at rates which are estimated to be between 1,000 and 10,000 faster than they have before, the mass extinction is on. And it's a result of a reduction of habitat spaces, it's a reduction of heavy pollution, it's a reduction of other factors such as hunting.
Yes, and I have a particular focus just in my layman's perspective, and that is I've always been extraordinarily fond of the ocean. That's where I go for my recharging my inner batteries, and it's been absolutely breaking my heart for the past 2 or 3 decades now, but especially recently, when we appear to have a number of metrics that are extraordinarily urgent, that we're literally killing off the ocean. We're looking at the death of coral reefs, and in fact the functioning fisheries of the planet before 2050. And I'm curious, is that part of what you're seeing as well?
Well, I'm not a biologist, actually. In my background, I'm a geologist and also Paleo Climatologist. I read about the current extinctions, yes, and like you, it breaks my heart.
Yeah.
I mostly look at events today, like I was saying before, in a deep time perspective. And when you look at the scale and the rate of what's happening, it belongs to the unthinkable. It's perhaps an order of magnitude faster than the last extinction 56 million years ago. And just as huge as what's happened when an asteroid hit the Earth, different than when the asteroid hit the Earth, which is 66 million years ago. Things happen within seconds and minutes. Now they happen within, well, maybe 2 centuries or so on, but it's still a lot faster than a previous extinction event.
Yeah. I recall in your earlier interview, you spent a little bit of time talking about that kind of accelerated timeline in terms specifically of Arctic methane and the release factor in that. And I'm curious first, if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about what you're aware of in terms of what's going on in the Arctic, and how is that seems to be one of the most bold examples of exponential increase in temperature, in methane release, and so on. I'd be very curious what you're seeing, and especially in terms of the relative acceleration.
That's right. Well, the Arctic is warming faster, 2 or 3 times faster than the average of the rest of the world, which is because of the change in albedo, in reflection. As ice melts, infrared radiation is absorbed by open water. And so it melts more ice, and so the cycle goes on. It's warming by several degrees, the average 3 or 4, but in place at the time it warms by much more, 10 degrees. Now the Arctic, and Canada, and also the seabed contains many hundreds of billions of tons of methane. And methane has a stronger greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide by about 25 or so, although it changes with time. The danger is, and already methane is being released. Already there are leaks and craters through Siberia, large parts.
Yeah.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
It's happening now. And the potential for release of, even if it was just a small percent of the buried organic matter, which contains methane, even a small percent would release enough greenhouse gas to the atmosphere to exceed the collapse melting point of the large glaciers. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the state of the planet, in the state of the habitable planet. the planet, of course, has always survived, but here we're talking about the biosphere. It's already very serious, and the potential is such that I switch my mind off to think about the ultimate consequences.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't like to worry people. Life has always been for the present, in the present, not about the past or the future. And I don't like to use language and terms which scare people to the effect that they just cannot continue. So that's not what I wish to do. So I try and stick to the scientific evidence, hoping that people will be able to draw the conclusions.
Sure, I can appreciate that, and I understand and respect that. I'm curious. I've just recently released my first book last summer called The Impossible Conversation, and it's really a story of how I learned how to learn about climate change, just to try and get my head around this extraordinary data that that I ran into about 3 years ago about abrupt. And in the middle of my research and so on, preparing to put together that book, I ran into a number of climate scientists that it was obvious to me, even though I'm absolutely a layman, I am no scientist whatsoever, but I could tell that they were being extraordinarily conservative in the words that they were choosing to use. For instance, talking about methane release in the Arctic and so on, they were extraordinarily self-governing in their conversation, watchful of every word that they would say. And I eventually asked them about it, and it wasn't just what you were saying, your concern for people and their reactions, their heartfelt reactions, but also there seems to be a lot of pressure on scientists in the USA right now, and for some time now, to really alter or change what they would say publicly, and even sometimes in what they'll report in their findings, in order to stay in the good graces of the people that write the checks for their positions. You know, that's that really shocked me. It really shocked me to find out that there was that much pressure on these scientists to not rock the boat, not upset the status quo. I'm curious if you are aware of that kind of influence there in Australia or anywhere else.
Oh, I'm very aware of it. Most of the pressure, well, at least in my case, does not come from outside. It comes from inside. I don't like to cloud people's day. It's not something I wish to do, in fact. So I'm trying to talk about the evidence, but I'm not trying to moralize or preach or lecture.
Yeah.
I think the role or the duty of the scientist is to report the evidence. It's very much the situation with medical doctors, oncologists. Even if they know that the patient has no future, they don't want to stress this point too much to the family. It's very similar, and similar ethics come into it. In my case, in a way, I'm fortunate in that my geological background leads me to think in deep time terms. Now, in deep time terms, there have been mass extinctions. It's the way of nature. But also, when you look at the species, any which can invent sources of energy, such as combustion, such as radiation, such as a nuclear splitting of the atom, any species which has been intelligent enough to develop them will have to be perfectly wise and perfectly in control to try and keep these powers from getting out of control. So, in philosophical terms, where can we find a species which absolutely 100% perfect. It's impossible. We are not. We are not. So once you can say Pandora box has been opened, I'm sure you know about Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Once it's been opened, once we have invented what we have invented, the possibilities, probabilities of accidents or design are there, and we are looking at the consequences. When you look at it in such deep time perspective, it's not easier to accept what's happening, but at least it's more understandable.
Yeah. I don't mean to spend too much time here, but I wanted to just go as a slightly different route. When I'm talking about the scientists that I met and interviewed in order to put my book together, I was particularly shocked that it wasn't just that they didn't want to alarm people. That was not their only motivation. It was that the powers that be, the economic and governmental powers that be, are especially in the States now, and it sounds like the same thing in Australia, that there is not much interest in the corporate or the governmental level to hear any disturbing news, anything that threatens to slow down the economic progress of a country. I think, for instance, of the huge coal mining projects going on in, I believe it's Queensland, there in Australia, and the projects promise to do tremendous environmental damage on their own before the coal is even burned, not to mention having massive destruction occur on the Great Barrier Reef. And those corporate and government forces are clearly pushing ahead the project against every conceivable measure from the scientific community of how detrimental it is. So I'm just curious, am I seeing it right for that particular example? And are you in agreement with that?
You are 100% correct, my friend.
Yeah.
100%. I talk with people in Parliament, have done so for years. Many of them know the evidence, know the facts.
Yeah.
It's very rare that any one of them will have the courage to divert from the official lines, from the party policies, take a stand. In the good old times, say the culture of Japan, if the king lost, or rather he would fall on his sword. Now people are even will not say too much, just for the fear of losing their privileges or position. Yeah. Something about lack of courage, but also the reluctance to talk about a subject which is so much bigger than all of us combined.
Yes.
There are a lot of factors, economic, political, psychological. People can easily lose a job and have lost a job here. Even years ago, climate scientists have been dismissed already some 20 years ago for we're even using the term climate change now is not very permissible in some places.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a large scale, but there is one factor that has not been looked at and recently has been highlighted by Professor Clive Hamilton. And when I think about it also, one scientist who has been pointing out to the reticence, which is the term, reticence of scientists from expressing their view is, of course, James Hansen.
Yes.
The great James Hansen, he has been, and if you have not talked with him or interviewed him, I highly recommend it.
Yep.
But when I talk about what Clive Hamilton has published, you see, people by and large have a huge blind spot to the connection relations of humanity with nature. We talk in most of the fields of knowledge and sciences, in history, in literature, in philosophy, in law, in economics, in politics, so goes. We talk about relation between people, either individuals, other groups of people, or nations, but much less so about the connection, relation, dependence between people and nature. So even intelligent people and conscientious people, they still talk about the climate issue in terms of relation between nations, government decisions, and so on. But really, they are not focusing on the evidence, which scientists do, on evidence for our relationship with nature itself.
Yeah.
Nature has been somehow drawn to the sidelines, but nature is coming back now. Nature now is responding to what humanity is doing. And of course, you know about Guy McPherson, what he says.
Yes.
I mean, I don't like the language and terms he uses. Not at all. I don't like these terms. I use only scientific terms. But any person will draw the conclusion from the science, which I think is possibly the best way.
Yeah.
To go around and say the world is ending is really, it's a biblical type of. Again, I think there's always been about the present. My parents lived through World War II. My grandparents lived through World War One, and they still survived because they had hope. Hope is essential, whether it's supported by evidence or not. You can't do without hope. I don't want to say things which remove any hope. And in fact, there is hope. We can talk about it later, but if humanity decided to invest the trillions which it invests in war, military and war, if humanity decided to invest it in carbon dioxide drawdown, sequestration, there would have been a certain chance, no one can say how much of a chance, but if they put this enormous dose into carbon dioxide drawdown, it would prevent the Earth, possibly, hopefully, prevent from warming much faster and possibly even reverse the trend.
Well, I sure appreciate you bringing up the concept of hope. And I'm wondering if it would be okay to stop there for a moment and just explore together, because this is one very important part of the work that my partner Carolyn Baker and I do in our work with people, trying to bring empowering tools and expansion of capacities to people who are trying to face this future. And hope is obviously right in the center of that. And I'm curious, when you use the word hope, I'm curious what you're meaning. And if I may, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the various definitions that we bumped into. When I hear the word hope, in my many conversations with people about this whole topic, more often than not, they're meaning something like, gee, I hope the experts find some answers to these pesky problems that we have going on so that we can get back to business and life as usual. So that's it's probably a little bit unfair of me to put it that casually, but it seems pretty accurate in my experience. I'm wondering if that's familiar. Is that similar to what you've heard people meaning when they say the word hope, or is there something different?
Yes, that's right. That's right. I see hope as life, and life is hope. You wouldn't get up in the morning if you didn't have a degree of hope of being able to live through the day. You would stay in bed. So to me, life is possible without hope.
Right.
It's inherent in it. But of course, when people lose it or something happens, to have to thank, whether thank God or thank nature, for being able to live even for one day, to have a sense of reverence towards nature, or in some case towards God. And yes, be thankful for the gift of life for one day, to me, is very central. So, quite regardless of what happened in the past, very terrible things, and what's happening now and happening in the future, I like to be thankful for the one day. Now, you probably know, in the worst situation in wars or in the concentration camps, there were people who had what I call an optimistic gene.
Yeah.
They had a life power which allowed them to survive, whereas other people did not.
Yeah.
So, to me, personally, when I think in deep time terms, that we're living at times when the consequences of a species that has invented, mastered enormous powers, is unable to control. And that, and combined with the concept of life for the moment, for the day, it allows me to go on despite of the understanding, the knowledge that we are not traveling through major tipping points. I must have sent you this article.
Yes.
The tipping points, whether it's in the Arctic, whether it's the hurricanes in the tropics, whether it's the huge fires which happen in several parts of the world, including California, the heat waves, all these factors combined and now tell us these are the classic tipping points of no return of the climate-driven to where in the past, through geological history, well, certainly of the last million years or so, when temperature rose during the interglacial periods, when temperature rose more than 1 degree, there was a freeze, what's called a stadial. The freeze results from the flow of ice-cold water from the big glaciers into the oceans. And this cools up the continents around, especially the North Atlantic. That's called a stadial. And what's very likely to happen is, rather than continuing smooth rise in temperatures, we're going to have a increase in variability. Very likely to be such a freeze for who knows how long, maybe tens of years, maybe centuries, which will result in a mini ice age, and then warming will continue because carbon dioxide keeps on accumulating. So the concepts which even well-informed people have about global warming, and which have been introduced by the International Panel for Climate Change, must be looked at, taken into account, that we're going to look at periods of not just smooth warming, but we're going to look at periods of enormous disruptions, both by hot fronts, tropical fronts, and by ice snowstorms.
Yeah, I get it. I definitely get it. If, with your permission, I'd like to just jump back to the topic you covered so beautifully before, because you mentioned a couple of words when you were talking about hope, a couple of words that I think reflected your particular stance about hope and about daily life. And I just wanted to offer you another person's perspective, because I really appreciated very much. You brought in the word, I think it was reverence. And what you seemed to be doing was implying a particular presence that you apparently have as you look into your day and look into this future, and assuming that other people are having it. And I guess I would like to do a reality check with you. You could tell me about wherever it is you travel or wherever you're familiar with, and obviously Australia. And I can tell you about my experience of here in the States, is that there actually is not much in the way of the kind of presence and the kind of reverence that you were talking about. And, I was, I said that phrase about hope, that it was a bit casual and probably not fair, but about gee, I hope we get back to business as usual as soon as possible. And that really is what I see the vast majority of, for certain, the American public to be in that mode. And there's extraordinarily little apparent consciousness, like you're describing, of a sense of reverence or a sense of being present to the miracle that it is that we're alive. I'm curious if you have a sense of that, kind of the public at large in Australia or elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for asking this question. A very important question. My own, individually, sense of reverence towards the earth and nature, it's expressed mostly in books of poetry which I've written, well, 2 books. And I'll be happy to send you copies of these books if you give me your address. That's where I express my feelings, my humanity. I try and keep my science somewhat separate from this, because science has to be, well, as objective as possible. So you're asking me whether I see it in other people. Yes, I do. Many, many, many individuals who are deeply agonized by the situation, not just about the climate and nuclear, the risk in different parts of the world. There are people who are deeply agonized. How they express it and to what extent it flows into public opinion, I'm not at all sure. You look at this enormous carnival and sports events and gambling and mass tourism around the world, and all the public phenomena which dominate the media, and you don't find this sense of reverence. You will find is some kind of live now and pay later. So on the mass scale, on the media scale, I do not see it. But when you meet individual people, you very often come across it.
Good. I'm so relieved to hear you say that. And I know, to be fair, that I know quite a few people who have that kind of reverence in their heart. But like you said, on the larger scale, it can be very discouraging. Yeah.
Yes, it drowns this say love and reverence of nature, creation. They drown in this. I often think about our civilization, particularly the Western one, in perspective of Roman civilization. I wonder how the Romans, they conquered the known world, then they destroyed much of the forest, they destroyed a lot of the tribes and a smaller civilization there. They sacrificed people in the Colosseum on the scale of hundreds of thousands and more. How did they perceive the world? How did they feel? I often wonder, because historical perspective is, of course, important.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious. That's something I've given quite a bit of thought to also. And I'm wondering, I'm stopped short of what you just said, because this seems like a time like no other. It really does seem like the stakes are much higher now than at any other time in human history. Can you set me straight on that?
Yeah, well, that's how it is. You pinned it down. You hit the nail on the head. In the future, survivors, and I hope there will be survivors, they will see us, and particular powers to be the leaders, as having committed the biggest crimes which they've ever committed on Earth.
Yeah.
It is a mass extinction of species. I can't see that civilization will survive it, but I hope that some people can in some remote parts of the world. You never know. You don't have crystal balls, but whether some people will survive in northern latitudes, in high mountains, in some Pacific volcanic islands above the level of sea level rise, because sea level rise is now committed to be, I'd say it's committed to be 5 meters, but as time goes on, it can be much more than that, which means the cradles of civilization on coastal and low river valleys will be inundated with salt water.
That's right.
But let me see, you've asked me, sorry, I'm trying to think about the specific question you asked me now.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was just letting you know that I want to take a historical perspective. I have curiosity about how past civilizations have looked at their own collapse, but I'm just curious if perhaps there's not that much to learn from them now, because the stakes are so high that it seems like we are, we're facing an ending where they faced massive transition, and I think that's an important difference.
I assume that you know, you have read the book by Gerald Diamond, Collapse.
Uh-huh.
That's about the collapse of civilizations, going back to the medieval warm period, to the Incas, the Aztecs, going back to the North American, Indian, it's going to Easter Island, and so on. And it's a classic book. It's a classic book that I recommend you read. The people at the time, the collapse, whether it was very sudden due to large volcanic eruptions or so, but more likely they have been gradual and to a large extent due to the cutting of the forests. That major droughts have set in and just agriculture collapsed. But there are examples there. Now, comparison with now, yes, now it's global.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's global because it's the composition, shift and change in the composition of the atmosphere and of the oceans, which are becoming acidified and warm. This is touching just about every part of the earth. So, and we are aware of it. We're watching it on TV. Communication now is such that, well, it is a true global village. In the past, whatever happens in other parts of the world, people might or might not have been aware of, but now we can't escape it.
Yeah.
We can't escape this knowledge now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so curious.
I'm sorry if what I say is, I'm sorry if what I say is depressing, but.
Oh, unfortunately, you and I both know that the news does not look so good, but I'm hearing in you a similar thread that's in myself and again, my creative partner, Carolyn Baker, where beneath the surface, if the surface is our fear and our despair and our depression, beneath that surface, in every person that I've worked with around this topic, there is a deep love of life that I think you were pointing to when you talked about the word reverence and the kind of presence you were describing that you bring to each day. And again, without that, perhaps that has something to do with my definition of hope, to be able to touch into the humanity and the life, the miracle of life underneath the surface of our busy world and our despair and our denial and so on. That's what truly keeps me getting out of bed in the morning, is to be able to touch the purity and the beauty of each moment as best I can. There's a word that, I'm not a religious person, but there's a word that I've spoken with a lot of religious scholars about, the word called grace. And I've been lucky enough to experience quite a bit of grace. And I think that's available to every one of us at every minute. But it's so easy to forget, and it's so easy to lose touch in our busy, busy world.
Yeah, it's all very true. I feel very much the same way as you do. In a way, I think two different lines. One, it's optimism or pessimism is irrelevant. We just look at the evidence, and from a scientific point of view, with the exception of drawing down carbon dioxide, which is a choice that humanity has, and which could work. There's no guarantee, but it could work. With the exception of this possibility, the science tries to point out to the realities of our lives and the world. But the other part of me is, not just a scientist, but also my poetry. I just have a deep sense of reverence towards the earth and its creatures. Just about the grieve about the birds and about, well, all other kinds of lives, as I do about our own humanity. And so that part of me, which I express mostly through poetry, through poems, this part is grieving. The scientific part is trying to look at just the world as it is. And then yet another part says, be thankful for a day's life. The butterfly only lives for one day. Just be grateful for awareness, a sense of awareness for one day, and don't ask for any more. So there are these really different streams of sentiments, which each one has a truth in its own right.
Oh, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Well, we've gotten to a place I had no idea we would touch because, I include so much of the the mytho-poetic world in order to find my heart in these troubled times, and I'm so pleased that you do the same. And I'm wondering if it would be okay if what I'm planning on doing is I'll post this interview, and I'm happy to send you the link if it's useful, and we can do that. And then if there's a way to connect with some of your poetry, I could then go back and add, with your permission, I could add a poem or two if you had a particular poem or two that you would like to be included in this recording. I could then post it fresh with whatever poetry you would like added to our interview today.
Yes, certainly. My poems are both published as hard copies, which I can send you, but they're also online, which means they are as electronic files, PDFs. I can send you these PDFs within the next even 5 minutes or so.
Oh, that's wonderful.
As to the ones,
Great.
And as to the ones selected, yes, I can recommend maybe 2 or 3 poems which I particularly like.
I would absolutely appreciate that. I know I said it at the beginning, but I'd like to just, as we're approaching the end of the envelope of our speaking to get today, perhaps it's in the same light that you were just saying about appreciating each day and perhaps each interaction as best we can. There's something extraordinary about being able to speak with you, a person who has as much knowledge of what I tend to call the sober data, basically the facts of what's going on out there. And And even though you have that knowledge, you find a way to keep your heart open and to keep yourself engaged with life. And I just find that deeply inspiring. So I thank you for that.
No, I really appreciate your comments and insights here, and vice versa. I appreciate your insight and outlook as well. Yeah. It takes two sometimes.
Yeah, it does. I guess I just have a couple more questions for you, and I'm also open if you have any questions for me. I'm wondering if you have anything that has recently come to your attention that has really got you concerned, in addition to whatever we're talking about.
Well, yes. I mean, until 2009, there was an impression that actually humanity come to terms or come to grips with what's happening. Yeah. Then came the Copenhagen conference, which we had enormous hopes for. But after that, things started to go downhill. So the concern was there all along, of course. Well, in the nuclear, which I see as just as serious and closely related. So the concern has been there for a very long time. But something which came up recently, well, I'd say there is now what I call a silence, high degree of cover-up. For example, one can hardly publish now in many media channels, and there are very few platforms now for climate scientists to continue to point to the evidence.
Yeah.
Where a lot of platforms were, in fact, the media and even the political classes were quite open to listen to what scientists had to say before 2009. Now, well, are still published in places such as Countercurrents and similar progressive journals, but even the more progressive outlets are now, they suffer from what I say climate fatigue. You can beat up that drum even if it's true, and it's true, and it's true, but you can beat it for so long before people just switch off. Yeah. They want to go back to daily life. They have to put bread on the table. The issue is so daunting. It's beyond human power, even beyond human imagination. And so all which I can do, and I think it's a duty of scientists to do it, is just keep pointing to the evidence with a hope, but it's not the degree of optimism that's perhaps, well, I think in a way Guy McPherson was correct when he says nature bets us.
Yeah.
People will become fully aware when the natural, or rather the extreme weather events hit even stronger than they already have. I'm afraid at that stage it could be too late.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Unfortunately, I agree. The second and perhaps final question, I'm wondering is there anything that's occurred in locally or globally recently that is encouraging to you?
Well, what is encouraging potentially is that technology is developed so fast for alternative energy and even carbon drawdown, that at least in principle, the possibility exists to have a major try to rectify what has already occurred.
Yeah.
Only if human attitudes have switched from wars, and really these are genocidal wars. These are totally dark.
Yeah.
Wars of no justification whatever. Just in my view, it just keeps on. The two major industries in the world are the fossil fuel industry and the military industrial complex. They thrive on what is happening now, and they have their own vested interest, and the expenses, the trillions which go into them, come at the expense of protecting life on Earth.
Yeah.
They claim to be defense industries, but really that's the opposite. And the only true defense now will be to try and protect nature, or what's left of it. Our so-called leaders either have no courage, either have knowledge but no courage, or mercenary hired by the Western interest.
Yeah.
So here we are moving into the politics of the matter, and that's all global.
Yeah.
It's certainly true in the Western countries, but it's also true in other parts of the world. Still, I always come back to life, the present, for myself, and if I knew what could be done, if I only knew.
Yeah.
But it's an evolutionary stage. I always come back to that. If a species harness powers greater than its degree of wisdom and control to be able to control, to limit, then it is an objective evolutionary development. We have done that. We have power to destroy, we have power to try to save, but somehow we don't seem, our species doesn't have wisdom and responsibility and control to do it. But I'm always happy to be proven wrong, always happy to be supported.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have this dual experience right now. I have the experience on the one side of having a very sobering and very difficult side of the conversation with you, and Professor Andrew Glikson from Australian National University, Earth and Paleo Climate Scientist, and obviously a heartful poet. I also get your love of life and your meaning to do the right thing with your expertise in the world and with your presence in the world. And it's just been it has been a mixed conversation, and it's been a delightful conversation and a very, very inspiring conversation. And I want to thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Really appreciate the opportunity to convey myself and my feelings, and it's very nice meeting you on the airways.
Yeah.
Yes, I really appreciate the link of this conversation, and I will send you the poetry books, both electrically and as hard copies. I will need to know your mailing address for that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I will be more than happy to follow your direction in terms of choices for some poetry that I can include in this particular interview and in the recording and posting of that. And thank you so much for your generous offer. I look forward to reading your poetry, and thank you so much for your bringing that on top of your expertise. It's a real gift.
Yes, thank you, Dean. It's nice meeting you, even though on the airwaves.
Okay. Well, I'm going to hit the off button now for a recording. So if you'll just hang on for one moment. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament Podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.